the major theories in psychology are relevant to sexuality: psychoanalytic theory, learning theory, social exchange theory, and cognitive theory. In this lecture, we will review the psychoanalytic theory dealing with Sigmund Freud and his stages of psychosexual development. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory has been one of the most influential of all psychological theories. Because Freud saw sex as one of the key forces in human life, his theory gives full treatment to human sexuality. Freud termed the sex drive of sex energy, libido, which he saw as one of the two major forces motivating human behavior. Freud described the human personality as being divided into three major parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the basic part of personality and is present at birth. It is the reservoir of psychic energy, including libido. Basically, it operates on the pleasure principle. While the id operates only on the pleasure principle and can thus be pretty irrational, the ego operates on the reality principle and tries to keep the id in line. The ego functions to make the person have realistic, rational interactions with one another. Finally, the superego is the conscience. It contains the values and ideas of society that we learn, and it operates on idealism. Thus, its aim is to inhabit the impulses of the id and to persuade the ego to strive for moral goals rather than realistic ones. To illustrate the operation of these three components of the personality in sexual situation, consider the case of the CEO of a corporation who is at a meeting of the board of directors. The meeting is also attended by her handsome, buff colleague, Mr. Hunk. She looks at Mr. Hunk and her id says, "I want to throw him on the table and make love to him immediately. Let's do it." The ego intervenes and says, "We can't do it now because the other members of the board are also here. Let's wait till 5 p.m. Then they're all gone and then we do it." The superego says, "I shouldn't make love to Mr. Hunk at all because I'm a married woman." What actually happens? Well, it depends on the relative strengths of the woman's id, ego, and superego. The id contains the set of instincts present at birth. The ego develops later as the child learns how to interact realistically with his or her environment and the people in it. The superego develops last as the child learns moral values. Freud saw the libido as being focused in various regions of the body known as erogenous zones. An erogenous zone is a part of the skin or mucous membrane that is extremely sensitive to stimulation. Touching it in certain ways produces feelings of pleasure. The lips, the mouth, are one such erogenous zone. The genitals is another, and the rectum and anus a third. Let's talk about the stages of psychosexual development. Freud believed that the child passes through a series of stages of development. In each of these stages, a different erogenous zone is the focus. The first stage, lasting from birth to about a year old, is the oral stage. The child's chief pleasure is derived from sucking and otherwise stimulating the lips and mouth. Anyone who has observed children of this age knows how they delight in putting anything they can into their mouths. The second stage, which occurs during approximately the second year of life, is the anal stage. During this stage, the child's interest is focused on elimination. Now, the third stage of development, lasting from age 3 to perhaps 5 or 6, is the phallic stage. The boy's interest is focused on his phallus, which is his penis, and he derives great pleasure from masturbating. Perhaps the most important occurrence in this stage is the development of the Oedipus complex, which derives its name from the Greek story of Oedipus, who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. In the Oedipus complex, the boy loves his mother and desires her sexually. He hates his father, whom he sees as a rival for the mother's affection. The boy's hostility towards his father grows, but eventually he comes to fear that the father will retaliate by castrating him, cutting off his prized penis. Thus, the boy feels castration anxiety. Eventually, the castration anxiety becomes so great that he stops desiring his mother and shifts to identifying with his father, taking on his father's gender role and acquiring the characteristics expected of males by society. Freud considered the Oedipus complex as its resolution to one of the key factors in human personality development. As might be expected from the name of this stage, the girl will have a considerably different and much more difficult time passing through it. For a girl, the phallic stage begins with her traumatic realization that she has no penis, perhaps after observing that of her father or brother. She feels envious and cheated, and she suffers from penis envy, according to Freud, wishing that she too had a wonderful wand. Presumably, she thinks her own clitoris is totally inadequate, or she is not even aware that she has one. She begins to desire her father, forming her own version of the Oedipus complex, sometimes called the Electra complex. In part, her incestuous desires for her father result from a desire to be impregnated by him, to substitute for the unobtainable penis. Unlike the boy, the girl does not have a strong motive of castration anxiety for resolving the Oedipus complex. She has already lost her penis. Thus, the girl's resolution of the Electra complex is not so complete as the boy's resolution of the Oedipus complex. And for the rest of her life, she remains somewhat immature compared with men. And I should say again, according to Freud. Freud said that following the resolution of the Oedipus or Electra complex, children pass into a prolonged stage known as latency, which lasts until adolescence. Now, during this stage, the sexual impulses are repressed, and so nothing much happens sexually. The postulation of this stage is one of the weaker parts of Freudian theory because it is clear from the data of modern sex research that children do continue to engage in behavior with sexual components during this period. With puberty, sexual urges reawaken and the child moves into the genital stage. During this stage, sexual urges become more specifically genital, and the oral, anal, and genital urges all fuse together to promote the biological function of reproduction. According to Freud, people do not always mature from one stage to the next as they should. A person might remain permanently fixated, for example, at the oral stage. Symptoms of such a situation would include incessant cigarette smoking and fingernail biting, which gratify oral urges. Most adults have at least traces of earlier stages remaining in their personalities. In regards to evaluating the psychoanalytic theory, from a scientific point of view, one of the major problems with psychoanalytic theory is that most of its concepts cannot be evaluated scientifically to see whether or not they are accurate. Freud postulated that many of the most important forces in personality are unconscious, and thus they would not be studied using the scientific techniques common to the 20th century. A key concept in Freud's theory is repression, a defensive act preventing certain information from becoming known or motivated forgetting. Feminists have also been critical of Freud's theory as a male-centered theory that may cause harm to women. They object to Freud's assumption that because women do not have a penis, they are biologically inferior to men. One could just as easily argue that men have a powerful envy of women's reproductive capability, which is just what psychoanalyst Karen Horney did when she coined the concept of womb envy. Nonetheless, Freud did make some important contributions to our understanding of human behavior. He managed to rise above the sexual repressive Victorian era, of which he was a member, and teach that the libido is an important part of personality, although he may have overestimated its importance. His recognition that humans pass through stages in their psychological development was a great contribution. In my next lecture, we will focus on learning theory and sexuality, focusing on classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. Do we actually learn about sexuality by observing others? Because according to social learning theory, children learn about sex and gender in part by imitation. I'll see you in the next lecture.